Welcome back, everyone. And if there are any new people to this, this our fourth and final panel and sixth and final element of the Bosnia 25 years after Dayton, after the Dayton Accords Symposium, virtual international symposium. Then welcome to you for the first time. It's been a delight. It's been a riveting event. I am, despite our chat about Zoom fatigue, if those in the audience overheard that, I'm sad to see this end, and I'm anxious to start planning with my co-conspirator here, David Pettigrew, for the next event next time. There are certainly many ongoing conversations that I would like to be not just one-off, but ongoing. This last event is a panel on the theme of memorialization. And we have a guest moderator with us today, a guest only in the sense of we're bringing her on now. Perhaps she should have been with us the whole time, but she's also the Associate Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here, as well as a faculty member in sociology and the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program. So her plate and desktop and table are constantly full, and we're very grateful to have her with us. So, of course, I'm speaking of Jasmina Besirovic-Regan. I've already mentioned her position here at Yale. She holds a PhD in sociology from Yale. Her dissertation addressed ethnic cleansing in Banja Luka and focuses on the emergence of a Bosnian Muslim refugee community. She also served as the Dean of Trumbull College for 12 years, spanning, I believe, her graduate and postgraduate time here. So Jasmina, thank you for joining us, and I will hereby turn it over to you to introduce the panel.
Excellent. Thank you, David, and thank you for the wonderful words. I'm so honored to be part of this group. I have been at Yale since the beginning of the Genocide Studies program, and I'm actually product of one of the program's fellowships, and I'm so glad that David is with us as well, since we collaborated for many years. But let me turn to our distinctive speakers today. I will provide a brief introductions of each of them before their presentations, and then we'll open questions. We'll open floor for your questions. So feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A block on the Zoom venue here, which is at the bottom of the screen. So our first presenter is Tomislav Pletenec, who is a professor at the University of Zagreb in the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology. His main theoretical framework includes post-colonial theory and theoretical psychoanalysis. Last 8 years of his research is focused on concept of cultural trauma, especially in post-conflict and post-genocidal societies. Our second speaker is Adna Karamehic-Oates, who is a director of the Center for Bosnian Studies at Fontbonne University in St. Louis. She spent 11 years at the Open Society Foundation in Washington, D.C. in a program management as well as advocacy roles focusing on Central and Eastern Europe. Adna holds a PhD in globalization and governance from Virginia Tech, where her dissertation focused on reconception of home and identity within the post-war Bosnian diaspora in the US. And finally, David Pettigrew, who is a professor at the Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven, and who is a huge, I think, a friend of Bosnia and a personal friend. He also teaches on Holocaust and genocide studies there. David is a member of many distinguished societies, including the steering committee of the Genocide Studies program at Yale. He's also a member of the board of the Bosnian American Genocide Institute and Education Center in Chicago, as well as advisory board member of the Post-Conflict Research Center in Sarajevo and international team of experts of the Institute for Research of Genocide in Canada. David has been lecturing about Bosnia and has published numerous articles and appeared on TV numerous times. So I don't do him a justice here. So why don't we turn to Tomislav's presentation first, and then we'll move it along. So Tomislav.
Thank you, and I like to thank, of course, David and Yale University, Southern Connecticut, to kindly invite me here. I know David for a long time now. It will be, I think, 8 years that we know, and we met first time in Srebrenica. So, of course, I have a great respect for him as a researcher and as a friend of Bosnia. So, not to go further, because it's a huge part of huge thinking, and I would like to be a little bit faster, not to take time from the others. So in the book Political Unconsciousness, Frederick Jameson stated that all symbolic acts are interwoven into the deeper realms of the society and history, thus point to the unresolved internal conflict that is inherent for society. For Jameson, symbolic act serves as a device for resolving inherent conflict. Following this path of argumentation, we could ask whether the genocide in Srebrenica could be understood as symbolic act, and what is internal social unresolved clash that made this genocide possible. By answering to this question, we can go further and analyze whether Dayton Agreement corresponds to that conflict, and is it also a sort of symbolic act with its own unconscious. It is, of course, ethically highly problematic to restrict atrocities to pure symbolic act, but it is possible, at least in my opinion, as long as we try to penetrate the motivation of the perpetrators and trying to understand what cultural prerequisites were present to enable transformation of ordinary citizens to cold-blooded killers. In that sense, we can start from the argument that genocide is possible in the moment when the life of the member of one group is interpreted through the sort of rigid designator that constrain her or him to only one meaning. Memories of the recent past are erased by the introduction of this rigid designator and reinterpreted from the new point. This operation is, for example, presented by Slavoj Žižek in book Sublime Object of Ideology. Its effect can be found in the anti-Semitic ideology that is able to construct new interpretation of the of reality, even if factual experience is apparently in contrast to ideological claim. Thus, real experience of the other as a polite neighbor, friend from the job, or even my daughter husband is interpreted as, and now I cite the quote from Žižek. You see how dangerous they really are. It is difficult to recognize their real nature. They hide behind their everyday appearance, and it is exactly this hiding of one knows true nature, this duplicity, that is the real nature, end of quote. The reason why this operation was possible in context of the Balkan should be found in the self-understanding of the societies in this particular area. Maria Todorova in Imagined Balkan provide insight into colonial nature of understanding the Balkan societies. Balkan was inscribed in the Western imagination as the half-wild, half-civilized, not exactly Orient, but not also the West proper. But what is missing from the account of Todorova is transculturation of the picture produced on the West. Mary-Louise Pratt, for example, defines transculturation as the ways in which colonized society adopt and transform the picture of themselves constructed by the colonizer. Transculturation in Balkan, due to designation of its liminal nature, was not similar to other colonized realms of the world. At the first glance, it might appear similar, but there is one striking difference. From the beginning of the colonization of the world, natives were constructing difference to colonial other through inventing pre-colonial tradition. But to invent tradition, one has to understand tradition as lost. Before something is tradition, it is a part of everyday life and as such differently understood. Colonial intervention in everyday life suddenly opened possibility to see the past as something lost. And in that moment, colonized society are caught up in the Western understanding of the past, producing it in the linear form. Opposing to colonizer takes the form implemented by the colonizer through tradition. Search for the authenticity, deeper self, and in the end, constructing the national identity in decolonizing processes were paradoxical invention of the colonizer. What makes this constellation even more complicated is that exactly those traditions were also partly invented by the colonizer to maintain the difference between them and the colonized in order to sustain the colonial presence, as Homi Bhabha summed up in expression, almost but not quite like us. Colonized society are thus left with the ambiguity over the status of tradition, their condition, but also that was a condition to build up a nation. But by incorporating them, they just confirm the difference from the colonizer. So there is no equality. Answer to the riddle always radical, either to get rid of tradition as something that is obstacle on the path to prosperity, or to celebrate them and oppose to colonial discourse. Both options came from the idea that is deeply rooted in evolutionist paradigm. Natural development of society is interrupted by some factor. For one side, it is a tradition, for another, colonizer types of modernization. Thus, the colonized identity is constantly divided between modernization and the past. Internal conflict cannot be resolved as long as evolutionist paradigm is structuring the self-understanding of society. Now, there are similarities in Balkan societies with this internal conflict of colonized society. Ivo Žanić, in his book Flag on the Mountain, showed how those conflictual narratives were organizing principles of the Croatian process of building nation during the last war. The symbolic expression of the conflict was portrait of the Hajduk, famous Balkan outlaw. Serbian uprising in 1990s was depicted as Hajdučija, the ways of Hajduk, by the officials in Croats. This understanding of Hajduk was in accordance with the way the Venetia or Habsburg Empire had described them during the 17th and 18th century. Thus, Croatian officials, president and prime minister, took symbolic position in accordance with the imperial civilized values, and Serbs rebels are positioned as problematic, wild entity, still faithful to the backward tradition that include violence, disobedience, and rejecting of the Western values. But as Žanić continues in the book, this interpretation shifted through time, and Hajduk, the outlaw, slowly became symbol of resistance to the West. What went on was a disappointment in Croatian society perceiving of the West, and for that reason society felt betrayed by the West. National imaginary of Croatia was built during the time when it was part of Kingdom of Yugoslavia and Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. In that political context, Croatian society produced ethnic difference to other nations as the one who had inherited Western values, and accordingly interpreted Yugoslavia, Serbia, and communism as an obstacle to the complete incorporation in the West and fulfillment of the social imagined destiny. But during the war, Croats found out that their position in Western imaginary is the same as other Balkan nations. Ideas of resistance to the West that does not understand us became new narrative for constructing national imaginary. In that way, symbolic designation of Hajduk started to oscillate between the being a freedom fighter and the criminal. Those two narratives are still circulating throughout Croatian society, no matter whether someone's addressing economy, culture, or politics. I think without much difference, maybe only in intensity or domination of one narrative, we can find them also in Serbia. Of course, for Croats, Serbs will be dominant obstacle as those who contaminated Croatian poor European character, and for Serb obstacle will be embodied in Slovenes, in Croats, but even more in Muslims, no matter whether they are Albanian minority or Bosnian Muslims. In nationalist myth, in Serbian nationalist myth, Slovenians deprived them of wealth by continuation of imperial Austro-Hungarian politics, which is manipulative and greedy. Croats goes hand in hand with the Slovenians, but they are also murderous fascists. And on the other hand, Albanians and Bosniaks were understood as a stain and remnants of the Ottomans that stopped Serbia from being civilized. Analogic to colonial situation, there is an internal unresolvable conflict in Balkan societies embodied in two possibilities. But this conflict is not immersed in the opposition between tradition and modernization. Modernization is sine qua non. What differs them from colonial context is that both narratives are just variation of two traditions. As product of discourse of liminality, not European, but not Orient, or maybe more precise, not us, but also not the other, Balkan identities are caught up in the feverish search for secret content that make them European and Western. The outcome of this research is digging out objects from tradition and history that can be used as evidence for incorporation to West, as it was the case in the night Croatia became a part of European Union. In that celebration night, we have seen different parts of Croatian tradition that were represented in high-tech format, from traditional music and craft up to important individuals that contributed to European science and culture. On the other hand, there is an understanding of tradition as mentality that should be preserved, not object. For example, love for freedom or standing for the cause, some mysterious national character that was also part of portraying Balkan by the West. Both interpretation of tradition answers to the same question. What does Europe want from me, and what is Europe? One answer is to find the tradition. One answer is to find the tradition who has objects that stand for embracement of values such as liberal economy, tolerance, multicultural politics, and so on. But there is also a second answer where one can position herself or himself as the actor that is worthy opponent, someone who will be hard to break, and as such gain the respect and acknowledgement, one who shows character. It must be emphasized here that both answers are not addressing some real West or real Europe. It is just a phantasmatic scenario that fills the inherent social contradiction, a traumatic core of society, as Zizek points out, and I quoting again Zizek, the stake of social ideological fantasy is to construct a vision of society that does exist, a society which is not split by antagonistic division, a society in which the relation between its parts and its organic are complementary. The clearest case is, of course, the corporative vision of society as organic whole, a social body in which the different classes are like extremities, members each contributing to the whole according to their function. We may say that society as a corporate body is a fundamental ideological fantasy, end of quote. This kind of fantasy always goes hand in hand with spectral counterpart, an obstacle that prevents its fulfillment. Internal conflict is displaced to some figure, as figure of Jew was for Nazi Germany. Although fantasy of corporate society can be found anywhere, in Balkan it takes a peculiar form. Its signifier is Europe as something which is at the same time outside, as some ideal, as some a goal that you have to achieve, and from the other side, something that you already possess. This antagonistic division then is doubled. One is inherent, so European qualities inherent to society, but their expression is prevented and the possibility to extract them and represent society as the whole. The other this is one possibility. The other one is passive. There is a qualities, but we cannot identify them. We are contaminated, we are backward, we are, I don't know, primitive, and we need the help from the outside to find them and do it for us. If it is double, then we have two spectral entities that are designated as an obstacle that corrupt natural evolution of society is stopped, or corrupt this natural evolution of society. One is already mentioned, member of the other ethnic group. Other is more peculiar. It is again signifier Europe. In second case scenario, the passive end, help from outside is not provided. Of course, we are dealing with a fantasy, not real Europe. A narrative of helping hand is constantly falling short because there is no such thing in reality as signifier Europe. There is no such Europe fantasized in Balkan. People become disappointed and see Europe as a corrupt entity that prevents society to fulfill their destiny, its destiny. That is the reason why I mentioned myth about Hajduk shifted in Croatia. In that way, second case scenario correlates with the first one. We will find our fantasy signifier Europe somewhere deep inside us, not out. Through this operation, two traditions, those of object and the national character, are merged into one interpretation of tradition. Social field that Jameson proposed as a place of conflict suddenly can be resolved by addressing both enemies, the West and historical foreign contamination. Europe and the foreign other became one at the same thing, absolute stranger. Scenario for the genocide is written as symbolic act of resolving social conflict. Now we can understand why criminal Mladic was mentioning Dahije after he rushed into the Srebrenica. In symbolic order, it was preparing for the last act of the narrative of betrayed Serbia. And he and his butchers were ready to take part in fantasy of ending the history. Mladic already pictured himself as legendary hero who will be celebrated as one who done what has to be done to liberate Serbia from the historical opponents. Ottomans, now presented in the members of Muslim religion, and UN as representative of the corrupt Europe and the West. As Europe was seen as the enemy, conviction and judgments of tribunal in The Hague are seen as the conduct of opposed party that is still preventing Balkan society to be what they should be. And the mass murders are still celebrating no matter what. Genocide triumphalism that Haris Halilovic is depicting as the last phase in post-genocidal situation has its origin in fantasizing of the society as whole. To celebrate murder is to keep this fantasy operational. It is exactly judgment of the war criminals that makes him more heroic as a fighter against corrupted Europe and West. It is important to understand that this kind of nationalistic fantasy is not the same as an anti-colonial structure, where supporting inherent tradition aside of opposing the colonizer culture. In case of Balkan society, it is the fantasy about colonial power that is protected. The whole idea of resolving the war wounds through international justice or even Dayton Accords fall short, as it always take a figure of the enemy. Dayton Agreement stopped killing, but at the same time provides continuation of the nationalistic imaginary. It is not surprised that in that way perpetrators are celebrated. Dayton Agreement works as the signifier of the repressed internal conflict of the Balkan society. Celebration of war criminals is not restricted just to Serbia, for example. Such celebration, as Walter Inziko said, can be found also in Croatia, Dario Kordic, for example. I have no time here further to analyze how political unconscious became juridical one, which Shoshana Feldman analyzed in her book, Juridical Unconscious. Let me just finish that social evolutionism play important part in unwritten part of the ICTY and Dayton Agreement. Through repressed social evolutionism, we can understand why today far-right movements open possibility to develop new racism based on the idea of survival of the fittest and constant clash of civilization, where even atrocities such as genocide can be approved, put in the context, and, I don't know, be celebrated in a way. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomislav, for your insightful presentation. Let's move on to Adna, who will present on preserving old memories in a new life, Bosnian diaspora in St. Louis.
Thank you, Yasmina. And let me also begin by thanking the hosts and the organizers of the Symposium, the Genocide Studies Program at Yale University and the Judaic Studies Program, as well as the Office of Academic Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. You've assembled a really fantastic set of panels these past 2 days, and I want to congratulate you on that. As Yasmina mentioned in the introduction, I'm with the Center for Bosnian Studies, which is located at Fontbonne University in St. Louis, Missouri. And many of you know that St. Louis is really the heart of the global Bosnian diaspora community. It has the largest number of Bosnians living outside of Bosnia, with nearly all of the members of the community having resettled after the outbreak of war and genocide in Bosnia in the spring of 1992. And estimates of the community, of the size of the community vary, but its population is believed to be about 60,000. So the work of the Center for Bosnian Studies began in 2006 under its original name, the Bosnia Memory Project. And it began under the initiative, the determination, and I should say the enduring passion of my colleague, Dr. Ben Moore. He had the foresight at that time to recognize the importance of the stories and the experiences that the Bosnian newcomers, the refugees to St. Louis were carrying with them. So he and others began conducting oral histories of survivors as well as their children, as material for building memory for the families as well as for the community in the longer term. Over the years, the Bosnian Memory Project grew significantly in its activities, which is why I'm also happy to say that the project was recently renamed the Center for Bosnian Studies, which is a much more accurate description of its role as a hub of resources on Bosnia. The mission of the Center for Bosnian Studies remains the same though, and that is to establish an enduring record of Bosnian genocide survivors and their families. And what I'd like to do today is share with you in a little bit more detail some of the different ways that the center is trying to preserve that memory. The first and certainly the most important way is by continuing the collection of oral histories. We now have over 200 of these testimonies. Each is approximately 90 minutes long, conducted either in English or Bosnian, depending on the preference of the individual giving the testimony. And the questions try to cover the individual's life prior to the war, specifically about their experiences of growing up and living in Bosnia before the war, then tracing their experiences during the war and how these events led to resettlement. And finally, some questions about how life was when they first arrived in St. Louis and how it has changed over the years. This is the basic structure of what we try to cover in an oral history. But of course, really the most important thing is for the person telling the story to recount it in their own way and in the fullness that they desire. This is also what makes the oral history methodology such a useful way of preserving stories and memory. In recounting their story in their own way, the individuals are also organizing their own narrative and understanding of what happened. And though I'm hesitant to overly generalize, I will say that in both the oral histories I've conducted with the Center for Bosnian Studies, as well as from the interviews I've done with members of the Bosnian diaspora in the United States for my PhD work, the most common organizing narrative is the complete lack of congruence between the experience of pre-war life and how that could have possibly been followed by the unspeakable crimes committed during the conflict. There's still, to this day, a persistent lack of comprehension about that. And that's important. It's a critical component of memorializing the collective experience through these individual stories because it further discredits the myth of ancient ethnic hatreds that still permeates in some circles about pre-war life in Bosnia. Instead, it confirms the opposite, that as Gagnon argued, violence along ethnic lines was a policy pursued towards a specific goal. And I'm quoting him here, "The violence of ethnic conflict is not meant to mobilize people by appealing to ethnicity. Rather, its goal is to fundamentally alter or destroy these social realities. Indeed, given the rootedness of such realities in people's everyday lives, the only way to destroy them and to impose homogeneity onto existing heterogeneous social spaces is through massive violence." So going back to the oral histories, while the center is interested in interviewing all segments of the Bosnian diaspora population, I will say that we do prioritize the testimonies of elderly members. And here we're simply fighting against time. We know that they carry with them stories that may never be told, but that one day may be very valuable, not just for the researchers, but even more importantly to the children, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Bosnians who immigrated to St. Louis. Sadly, we know that we've already lost 3 individuals that did share their stories. So we want to offer the elderly members of the diaspora the opportunity to create a record of their experience, to share their story. But we also know the effort that this takes and the emotions that it brings up, that cannot be underemphasized. And we feel an enormous sense of responsibility when we are entrusted with an oral history. As we collect the oral histories, we're archiving and digitizing them. And we're protective about who accesses them and for what reasons. We have developed an indexing system and now we're going through all the existing recordings to organize the material in such a way that will be most useful for future research. The oral history component of the center's work is an ongoing project, and it's also evolving with the diaspora. There is now a younger generation of Bosnians coming of age in the different communities. Many of them were either very young when they left Bosnia, or they were not even born there, meaning that even in the scenario where their parents maintain aspects of Bosnian culture within daily life, the family travels to Bosnia frequently. Diaspora children cannot but develop hybrid cultural or even national identities. They can't help developing a different relationship to the past than that of their parents. So memorializing the experiences of Bosnian survivors and their families means also capturing these shifts and their effects on the identity of the Bosnian diaspora. And this is why we are also proactively reaching out to younger Bosnians for oral histories, and we're seeing the complexities and contradictions of the past and present mixing and impacting their identity. And let me read to you quickly an excerpt from an oral history I did with a young woman that really crystallizes some of these identity struggles of the younger generation. She said, "I think the older that I get, the more proud that I am of being Bosnian. Maybe at some point I didn't really want to tell people I'm Bosnian because you had to explain, especially here, it's difficult. You just didn't want to talk about it. And then they ask you about being Muslim. And with all that happened with 9/11, it was just, now they're going to think I'm a terrorist. So I didn't really want to. Not that I didn't want to associate with Bosnians. I have a lot of Bosnian friends and I love being Bosnian, but I just didn't want to go into the story of who I am." The younger generation is the focus of a second, more educational component of the center's work, but that also has an important role in memorialization. For several years now, Fontbonne has been offering a course on the Bosnian genocide. The center is also working with local high schools in the St. Louis area that have significant populations of second generation Bosnian students on a class titled Bosnian American Studies. In both settings, many of the students are American and they've chosen the class because they want to learn more about their friends and their friends' families. But in both settings, we continue to see second generation Bosnian students. They often say that they took the class or taking the class because they don't know enough about their parents and grandparents' wartime experiences, and they do want to know. They know that there is trauma in the family. They can feel it. They know that trauma touches and impacts them, but they don't know the details. And this is one of the effects of the brutality of the war as well. When the crimes are so horrendous, they're too difficult to be recounted. But when they're not recounted, they also risk being unknown and ultimately forgotten. So these courses, the Fontbonne course and the high school courses, they're educating, but in educating, they're also memorializing and creating important understanding of why the Bosnian community in St. Louis is there in the first place. There's one final component in the center's effort to establish a record of experiences of Bosnian survivors and their families that I'd like to mention. Earlier this year, the center acquired the entire run of 3 diaspora publications, the newspapers Sabah and Diaspora Bošnjačka, and the refugee magazine Plima. These were publications established by members of the community for the community, and they're really a treasure of insight into the issues facing the newly arrived population of Bosnian refugees. Plima magazine, for instance, was published between 1997 and 2000 in St. Louis and was geared at the whole family to address their needs and concerns with really basic but vital information for that period and resettlement, such as where to get secondhand furniture or get a social security card. And this is important because when Bosnian refugees began arriving in the United States during the 1990s, for Bosnian Muslims in particular, there were very few pre-existing, explicitly Bosnian communities into which they could readily blend and who could support them. This was also in contrast to communities that identified as Croat or Serb, which were formed in historic migrations, long predating the conflict. So the arrival in the United States for Bosnian Muslims, as well as those Bosnians in mixed marriages or who rejected ethnic categories as a basis for their identity, was a truly challenging time. And these publications helped mitigate their challenges and help community members reassert some control over their lives, find a way to live normal life in their new home, while also keeping them connected to their old home through news and information. Sabah, Diaspora, Bošnjačka and Plima are part of a unique digital collections of the center. Both Plima and Diaspora have already been digitized and formatted for text searches. We're still working on the digitization of Sabah, but together, these three resources can be of distinct interest to Bosnian descendants and scholars in the future. I want to close by saying that for Bosnia and the survivors of genocide, memorialization has never been as important as it is now. For St. Louis as a place, it will always be important to preserve and understand the experiences of its Bosnian neighbors, because they've had such an important and positive effect on the city. Even more important, however, is to make this lasting and essential contribution to the historical record on the genocide and displacement of Bosnians, especially in the context of the persistent culture of denial about the crimes that were committed. It may be now 25 years since Bosnia has been at peace, but that peace, as we all know, has been brittle. It's been under constant pressure, and the primary driver of that and the primary driver of the instability that plagues Bosnian politics and society is the denial that persists in Serbia and Republika Srpska in particular, but also in global spaces and the media. Memorialization is one of the tools to counter the narrative of genocide denial, and making sure that the voices of survivors and witnesses is heard in whatever format and places we can do that is more important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Adna, for this insightful presentation. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. And last but not least, our friend David Pettigrew, who will present on the tragic legacy of the Dayton Accords, 1995 to 2020.
Thank you very much again to my co-host, sponsors, panelists, those who attended, and it's wonderful to be introduced by Yasmina. We are on the same panel at a conference in Sarajevo in 2007, July 2007, and I learned so much from her presentation. It has shaped my research and also the shape of the documentary film I was making with my son at the time. So it's so great to see you today. As we reflect on the legacy of Dayton, it should not escape our attention that Bosnia and Herzegovina was the victim from 1992 to 1995 of international aggression from Serbia and from Croatia. Indictments and convictions at the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, have identified members of joint criminal enterprises responsible for orchestrating the aggression involving Serbian and Croatian nationals in various documents, including Presidents Tudjman and Milosevic. At the end, General Mladic addressed a letter to Milosevic with a copy to General Perisic to express his gratitude for the invaluable assistance that the Army of Republika Srpska had received from the Federal Republic of Yugoslav authorities. Mladic said he couldn't have done it without them. Of course, Milosevic was indicted for genocide and other war crimes in 2001 as part of his own designs on a greater Serbia. Perhaps we should also recall that Bosnia had already sued Serbia for genocide in the International Court of Justice in March of 1993. Subsequently, the ICTY chamber found that the criminal enterprise in the Perlic case involved Croatian nationals, quote, whose goal was to permanently remove the Muslim population from Herzegovina. However, in spite of being eventually implicated in joint criminal enterprises, Tudjman of Croatia and Milosevic of Serbia were signatories to the Dayton Accords in 1995. Milosevic was representing Serbia as well as representing the leadership of Republika Srpska by virtue of something called the Patriarch Paper, since Mladic and Karadzic were already indicted for war crimes and were unable to attend. There were, however, representatives of the Bosnian Serbs at Dayton who had not yet been indicted. These included Momcilo Krajnik and General Zdravko Tolimir. But both Krajnik and Tolimir were also eventually indicted and convicted of war crimes. Tolimir was convicted of genocide in the first instance verdict and sentenced to life in prison. So this was the negotiating team at Dayton. That it was the negotiating team then bears mention. The character of the negotiating team might have provided some foreshadowing of the problematic fate of the peace agreement. For in the years following the Dayton Accords, both Croatia and Serbia have worked to undermine Bosnia and Herzegovina as a sovereign state. Each has encouraged separatist, secessionist initiatives in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Republika Srpska, arguably pursuing their territorial goals from 1992, which some people call war goals. Their tactics to undermine Bosnia's sovereignty have included anti-Muslim and nationalist propaganda and genocide denial. Prime Minister of Serbia, Ana Brnabić, for example, refused to acknowledge that the atrocities committed at Srebrenica in July 95 were genocide in a televised interview on the Deutsche Welle in 2019. In addition to this negative influence from Serbia and Croatia, there has been the internal source of destabilization, Republika Srpska. It was Milosevic who oversaw the legitimation of Republika Srpska at Dayton, one of the two entities demarcated by the agreement. The founders of Republika Srpska had officially declared the geographic territory of Republika Srpska and subsequently sought to secure the territory as ethnically homogeneous. This intent is indicated in the name Republika Srpska, or Serb Republic, which was a linguistic violence, since it implied that the territory was for Serbs only, while it had been historically multi-ethnic or multicultural. It should not escape our attention that the ICTY trial chamber in the Karadzic judgment determined that there was a common plan to, quote, permanently remove Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats from Bosnian Serb claimed territory. This Bosnian Serb claimed territory to which the judgment refers is Republika Srpska. I've referred to this eliminationist project in my research as a geography of genocide. Having officially declared the ethnically homogeneous territory, the founders of Republika Srpska carried out the aggression from 1992 to 1995 against the civilians of Bosnia, the cities, towns, and villages, committing atrocities that have been judged to be war crimes, including crimes against humanity and genocide. However, in spite of the atrocities, which were certainly publicized and for which the perpetrators had already been indicted, the ICTY had been formed in May 1993. At Dayton, the Bosnian Serbs were rewarded in the sense that Republika Srpska was recognized and legitimized as an official entity in Bosnia. In other words, the recognition of Republika Srpska at Dayton can be seen as a reward for a successful genocide, or at least for an attempted genocide. Co-aggressors, Serbia and Croatia, participated as co-signatories in the imposition of this constitutive instability that would undermine Bosnia's national sovereignty for the next 25 years. In other words, following the legitimation of Republika Srpska in 1995, the authorities have undertaken concerted efforts to exclude non-Serbs from returning to their homes, from which they were forcibly expelled. A return that was guaranteed by Annex 7, discussed by Haris Halilovic yesterday, thus continuing efforts to achieve the goal of ethnic homogeneity. Such efforts include the intimidation of returnees through hate speech, genocide denial, glorification of war criminals, and suppression of memorials for the victims. In 2014, a plaque glorifying Ratko Mladic was installed on a hill above Sarajevo, from which his forces assaulted the civilians and killed more than 11,000 people. In 2016, a plaque commemorating Radovan Karadzic was affixed to a dormitory in Pala. A monument that glorifies the perpetrators has stood in the middle of Visegrad for years, and it was joined more recently with the installation of an Orthodox Russian cross dedicated to the Russian volunteers who fought with Republika Srpska. In addition, Milorad Dodik, now a member of the presidency of Bosnia, undermines Bosnia's existence by challenging decisions of the National Court, challenging the authority of the High Representative, and threatening secession. And his secessionist moves have been significantly supported recently by Bosnian Croat counterparts. In other words, Republika Srpska seeks to prevent Bosnia from functioning as a state, undermining any hope of restorative justice that would lead to reconciliation. Genocide denial and threats of secession have been wielded by the leadership of Republika Srpska with impunity. And the failure of the international community to respond to these destabilizing provocations have led arguably to the public celebration of the atrocities, a phenomenon Haris Halilovic has referred to as triumphalism. A triumphalism that re-traumatizes the victims and threatens a repetition of the atrocities. Sadly, triumphalism is part of the legacy of the Dayton Accords. Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide and championed its inscription in international humanitarian law, described genocide in these cultural terms. Quote, genocide has two phases: destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group and the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. In other words, genocide for Lemkin involved this erasure and replacement of the cultural existence of the targeted group. This idea can be seen in terms of the Bosnian Serb destruction of over 1,000 mosques, and in some cases, the construction of Christian Orthodox churches directly on the ruins, or in terms of the intent of Visegrad municipality to bulldoze and erase the existence of the Pereniska Street house, where 59 innocent Bosniaks were burned alive in 1992. So this is not only a cultural erasure, but the wanton destruction of the world that the victims had inhabited. It's this destruction of the world of non-Serbs that can also be seen as the legacy of Dayton, a destruction that entails a denialist narrative articulated by the memorials glorifying the perpetrators. In August 2019, I visited the Prijedor area and the sites of former concentration camps with Satko Mujagic, a former prisoner. Satko showed me a monument in a park in Prijedor, which was essentially, it's a very arresting visual image. Essentially men, soldiers, human figures emerging from a cross titled "For the Holy Cross." 2 days later, I was in Brčko for a book promotion tour with Isak Gashi, who survived Luka concentration camp in Brčko and went on to become a witness in a number of key ICTY trials. I noticed another massive monument centrally located with a similar motif of men or human beings emerging from a stone cross. This monument was dedicated to the Serb defenders of Republika Srpska. I had the intuition that these monuments were the work of the same artist. But before learning the identity of the sculptor, I knew that they were glorifying the so-called army of Republika Srpska, the forces that had committed atrocities that have been judged to be genocide, crimes against humanity, and other war crimes. I subsequently learned from Isak that these memorials were part of a body of work of the sculptor Miodrag Živković, and a scholar from Chicago, Edin Hajdarpasic, wrote an important article about Živković recently. His other nationalist monuments celebrating the perpetrators in Republika Srpska have been installed in Bijeljina to the fallen Serb fighters, in Derventa to the fighters of the Patriotic War, in Modrica to the fighters for freedom, and in Mrkonjić Grad to the defenders of the fatherland. These provocative monuments to the perpetrators across Republika Srpska reminded me of a meeting I had with the legal team at OSCE in 2014, when the team explained to me that of the existence of a law in Republika Srpska providing monuments for the heroes of the War of Liberation. In other words, this is a complete erasure of the past and a delegitimization of the former residents who were victims of the genocidal policy of Republika Srpska. Again, the legacy of Dayton. When I spoke to Richard Holbrook, the lead negotiator at Dayton, in a brief conversation in 2009, I bluntly, having the opportunity, identified the recognition of Republika Srpska as a legitimation of genocidal geography, a dehumanizing zone of discriminatory exclusion that continues the founding genocidal impulse. I proposed that the political existence of Republika Srpska needed to be addressed through constitutional reform. He agreed with me, he said, but he doubted it would be practical. He described the founding leaders as, or say he took the opportunity to refer to them as opportunists, thugs, and criminals. In his book, To End a War, Holbrook had already expressed his great frustration with the recognition of Republika Srpska, stating that to divide Bosnia into two parts would legitimize Serb aggression. And in 2005, he wrote, "I still regret agreeing to let the Bosnian Serbs keep the name Republika Srpska for their entity. Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović was right when he told me it was a Nazi name." So the Dayton Accords attest to the failure of the international community to recognize and stop the genocide in progress from 92 to 95, the failure to create a just peace at Dayton, and the failure to support state building, justice, and reconciliation in the past 25 years. As Republika Srpska wields genocide denial, challenges to the Constitutional Court, and threats of a secession with impunity, the international community's failure to facilitate a modicum of civility has betrayed the possibility of a meaningful future for the next generation. Its failure has undermined the possibility of restorative justice that would subtend state building. So as we mark the 25 years since Dayton, it is imperative that the international community address the tragic legacy I've described. One crucial initiative would be for the High Representative, who has the responsibility to oversee the peace, to use his bond powers to implement the law against genocide denial and against the glorification of convicted war criminals. This would be important for survivors who are traumatized by these threatening and dehumanizing speeches and memorials. A legal framework for such legislation can be found in the Council of Europe Framework Decision of November 2008 on combating expressions of racism and xenophobia by means of criminal law. The framework decision indicates that member states shall ensure that publicly condoning, denying, or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide is punishable. Switzerland and Belgium have passed such laws against genocide denial. And these laws, of course, are based on a tradition of laws against Holocaust denial in Austria and Germany. So all of this provides a conceptual model for this long overdue legislation in Bosnia. The laws share the idea that the denial of genocide is an act of hatred and discrimination, since it minimizes or justifies the barbaric crimes suffered by the targeted group, minimizing not only the crimes but the suffering, and in this way entails a threat that the crimes could be repeated, thereby rendering the group unworthy of empathy or protection against harm and rendering them vulnerable to a repetition of the harm. Such laws would need to criminalize the denial not only of the Srebrenica genocide, but also of war crimes. So while the EU directive and related laws in Europe provide a compelling model, the fact is that a model already exists in Bosnia in the Criminal Code of the Federation under Article 163, analogous to the EU framework insofar as it bears on inciting national, racial, or religious hatred, discord, or hostility, and criminalizes public denial or justification of genocide, established by a legally binding decision. An even more complete model exists in the amendment to Article 145A of the Criminal Code of Bosnia and Herzegovina that was introduced by Zlatko Mladic in the House of Peoples this year. Article 145A, inciting national, racial, and religious hatred, discord, or hostility, criminalizes public denial or justification of genocide and crimes against humanity or a war crime established by a legally binding decision. But this amendment went even further, responding to the situation in Bosnia by criminalizing the glorification of war criminals. So and now in this 25 years after the signing of the Dayton Peace Agreement, we must call on the High Representative to ensure that such laws are implemented by virtue of the bond powers if necessary. Of course, the amendment was blocked in the House of Peoples by a Serb-Croat coalition, but last year the High Representative all but promised to pass such a law, and he received a petition with more than 8,372 signatures calling for this use of the bond powers. So this would be an important step towards the possibility of a just future for Bosnia. Finally, just to conclude, it's imperative for the international community to resist and condemn threats of secession and destabilization, and recognize Bosnia's sovereignty by expediting its membership in NATO and its entry into the EU. Laws against genocide denial, entry to NATO, and EU membership should be the focus goals to support long overdue state building in Bosnia and to address, finally, the tragic legacy of Dayton. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that insightful presentation. We'll open now the floor to the questions. If you have any, you can put them in the question and answer block on Zoom, which is located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And maybe David, the other David, can help me if anything comes in. I may pose just a general question. I think you provided 3 different perspectives in terms of philosophical approaches to political consciousness, in terms of what the diaspora is doing in terms of memorialization. And obviously, David suggested some new, not new really, but new imperatives for the international community to help. How do you feel, I mean, personally, about the future of Bosnia? I mean, we have heard also about, I think Balma talked about the lack of Ministry of Education and the one education system. I think we heard presentation reparations and still all kinds of difficulties that exist in Bosnia. Are you optimistic about its future? I mean, are you pessimistic? I mean, where do you think we are going to? Because it has been already 25 years, a lot more could have been accomplished in this time in terms of human rights issues, in terms of genocide and so on. But where do where do you stand, I guess? Do you expect that there will be another conflict with Dodik and even Croatian sides often threatening with succession and building these provocative monuments and so on? So that's a question for all of you if you want to ponder a little bit about.
Can I?
Sure, Thompson.
Yeah, I still think sadly that the key to the Bosnian problem is outside of Bosnia still. And this, I feel, this is regretful basically for me. But because the Dayton Accords are also made outside of Bosnia. And the only possible way is to change the politics of Croatia and Serbia to Bosnia, so that they promote a more tolerant, more Bosnian sovereignistic policy, treat them as the equal partner, not as a colony, and things like that. But what is frightened me more, that this politic of division in Bosnia is really sort of, I think that it's behind it, it's economy. And I think that now you have structures of power, financial power that lives on division. And they are very afraid to change the situation as it is. Because when it's changed, for example, we have a great example from Stolac, where they have the citizen initiative, they almost won the election. And the day after, the whole ministry of Croatian Right Party, HDZ, were in somewhere in Stolac, you know, the ministry of the Croatian government. So you see that any such initiative, it's threat for the much broader you know, structures than so this is really very problematic in my opinion.
Thank you, Tomislav. David, do you want to? Oh, Adna, sorry.
Yes, no, I was going to actually agree completely with Tomislav as well, that there is, you know, there's an interest now within Bosnia among the political structures of keeping things the same and staying in power. And, you know, that is, I think, on all sides as well, that it benefits all sides. And that is something that we really have to fight against and support, you know, political parties that are trying to sort of shift that ingrained corruption, ingrained political power. That is really the only way to change the situation from the inside. And also, you know, coming back to the US election, I think I'm a little bit more hopeful today than I was yesterday about Bosnia's future. Not that that is going to be the answer, but it certainly helps to have somebody that is also familiar with the background, because, you know, for the last many years, we've also had, you know, people who have been not as familiar, who have been too busy. There have been crises, but, you know, with potentially this new administration, you have somebody that has been there and understands the history. So that's my sort of input.
Thank you. David, are you hopeful at all, or?
Well, we have to be hopeful, and you know, I think that's why we organize a program like this, to try to talk to each other, to raise awareness, educate people about the situation, and I think that there is a path to the future. I appreciated the fact that the High Representative said he felt the need to return to a more prescriptive mode, setting deadlines, and trying to establish a rule of law. Now he seemed optimistic about a law against genocide denial, and I know when he spoke at the Srebrenica commemoration in this year, it's 2020. He called for the person who, you know, installed the plaque on the dormitory for Radovan Karadzic to take it down, which was, you know, I think he felt he could do under the circumstances in the absence of a law. And but the reason, so I think it's possible to work, and that should be our goal. That should be our hope, to, you know, to roll back this, what I call the zone of dehumanizing exclusion that's been laid down in Republika Srpska. But when I look at the, I really wanted to show you on the screen, but I wasn't sure I would be adept enough at it, to show you these massive monuments by Živković. It's like, this is not just a little plaque, you know, or on the wall for Mladic, but these really occupy or colonize the public space. And Blair, the Serb defenders of Brčko. So I find that really a daunting prospect, but I think we have to hope that we can develop a strategy.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, maybe for Adna. One question is, why did St. Louis become such a magnet for Bosniaks in the US? And also, is the Oral History Project limited to Bosniaks in St. Louis, or is it broader? Is anyone else conducting similar projects in the US?
Thank you for those questions. I think on the first one, you know, I was explaining this to my fellow panelists before the event started, that this is one of those, you know, situations where you have a really sort of administrative things that determine the future of so many thousands of lives. So St. Louis became a magnet because there were the conditions in St. Louis were, with low unemployment, or plenty of jobs, low housing costs, and also institutions, organizations, resettlement agencies that applied to the State Department resettlement program to support new arrivals. So it was these confluence of factors. And so there was no pre-existing population in St. Louis that then, determined this. It was simply these other issues. What has happened since then, as the population, as the resettlement agency supported this initial wave of Bosnians to St. Louis, and I should say a lot of them were people who were being forced to leave Germany in 1995, but the conditions were not right for them to be sent back to Bosnia. The U.S. opened this resettlement program, so a lot of them, it was their third, I guess, their from Germany to the United States is what you see a lot among a lot of this population. But also there has been since then, a chain migration as the community developed, as the Bosnian community revived the downtown, opened stores, then, more smaller communities around the United States, they moved to St. Louis to be closer to, some friends or relatives, or just to be closer to this existing community. So it had that effect. For your second question about, is the Oral History Project limited to Bosniaks in St. Louis? It's certainly not. I think I mentioned that we at the Center for Bosnian Studies are very much interested in interviewing all segments of the Bosnian diaspora population. I think what we do find, obviously because of the ethnic cleansing, the majority of the population tends to be Bosnian Muslim. But we are very interested in also getting the perspectives of different groups and segments of the population, because it's only in that way also that the full experience and the diversity of experiences can really be captured, and that's what we're after.
Thank you. And there's also kind of related question about are there any institutions that collect materials or oral history of non-Bosnians who were active during the war? So peacekeeping, aid workers, journalists, and so on. Are you aware of any institutions that have that kind of collection?
I'm of course familiar with, the individuals, many of you probably are, the individual sort of memorials or books written by journalists, by peacekeepers. I'm not personally aware of any institutions that collect that. I could be wrong. So I would actually open this up to David and Tomislav and David as well. Yeah.
Well, I'm more aware of the work of the Srebrenica Memorial Center in Potocari that's archiving material of all kinds from journalists, activists, survivors, and they're doing amazing work. Also, Remembering Srebrenica UK is gathering survivor testimonies and information about people who were involved during the aggression. I was thinking of it's been a long time, but I remember I wrote an article, which you wouldn't know from the title, called "The Task of Justice." You wouldn't know from the title what it was about, but it's a collection, it's a reflection on all the different journalists and aid workers and someone like Kliakov, for example, who was involved in exhumations of the mass graves. So it was a reflection, philosophical reflection on all their different writings, how the experience deeply impacted them, and how it then impacts the reader of their works. So that's not an institution, but it's if you are interested in that article, I can help you find it. It's called The Task of Justice.
And if I can just jump in to add that the Genocide Studies program at Yale does not have something exactly like that for Bosnia, but we've thought about it. And, I think the most important thing is that this sort of, these materials are archived and collected first and foremost in Bosnia, but for things that that we can do, and that it's appropriate to have sort of second copies of, or if there's something that makes sense for us to do, we're always willing to consider sort of mini archives along those lines. So, and in fact, I had a discussion a few months ago with our very first panelist on this whole symposium, Janine DeGiovanni, about exactly that, about finding a place that journalists in particular could share notes from their time and archive notes from their time in Bosnia during the war. In part as a sort of something that can stand against denial, would be one purpose for doing it. That collecting these mainly are often American, but also other Europeans, non-Bosnians, eyewitness testimonies and notes about what they saw from 92 to 95, and having there be a place where you can go when someone says that didn't happen. You could say, well, no, actually, and I know of where there are archives that shows that it does. So I think it actually, it's a global effort, and it's I'm sure that's part of what motivates collecting testimonies as well. So I'm hopeful that the Yale Genocide Studies program will continue to be a part of that. Apologies for the self-plug there.
Tomislav, is there anything in Croatia that you're aware of in terms of, it's too close maybe and too controversial?
Well, I started as young researching, collecting the oral histories from refugees from Prijedor, and it was really a traumatic experience for me. I was really young and completely unprepared. I had like a big crash from my first fieldwork in life. But yeah, so we started to collect a lot of refugee stories during the 90s, and this is in the archive of our institute. But the question was whether others, not just victims or perpetrators, have some some archive. It would be really interesting. There are some books published but it's in Dutch about the Netherlands and Dutch battalion experience in Srebrenica, which would be, really, really interesting to read. But of course, some of those witnessing is highly classified still. And you have this problem, and this is the only missing link somehow, at least for me, this missing link to understand the full picture, to have a full picture about the genocide in Srebrenica. So I would really, sometimes like to look into this kind of archive.
And I think we, David, if I'm not wrong, we were approached maybe about collaboration with Adina Bečirević from Sarajevo. I think there are these kinds of initiatives percolating on, especially in Sarajevo. But as you mentioned, I think it's a global effort, but it's a wonderful idea. And this is what these studies programs are obviously all about. Someone else had a question, very specific questions about maybe some books or articles that present a measured perspective on the Dayton Accords and what it meant for Bosnia. So I know one of you mentioned Holbrook's book, obviously, To End the War. Do you have any other suggestions that are good books on the Dayton specifically?
I mean, I would maybe plug my PhD chair, Dr. Jared Toll, but it is really a fantastic book. It's Bosnia Remade. And it's Jared Toll and Carl Dahlman. They're political geographers, so they're looking at it from the perspective of, this movement of populations, ethnic cleansing as a way of remaking a map and remaking communities, and the implications of Dayton sort of making that even more concrete on paper. So I would highly recommend that one.
Anyone else? No.
I would, yeah, I'm unmuted, great. Peter Lippman's book, which David, I actually don't have the book right in front of me, so the titles escape me, but I think that's well worth looking at as well.
Well, it's Surviving the Peace.
Surviving the Peace, which Peter Lippman was the second panelist that we had in our very first panel yesterday morning.
There's a book by Derek Chollet called The Road to the Dayton Accords, a study of American statecraft.
Mm-hmm.
Another option. Well, Peter's book is excellent. It's really the result of his relationships on the ground with people for the past 2 or 3 decades.
Okay, thank you.
Oops.
Any other questions? Go, David.
I certainly don't want to monopolize, but this has been a fascinating panel, and I'm grateful for all 3 panelists for their contributions. So much centers on, there's almost a paradox of identity, starting with the point that one of the things that makes the violence in Bosnia, the atrocities and violence, genocidal, was that it was an effort to eliminate an identity. And sometimes it's not just the people who hold that identity, but in a broader sense, the identity itself. So clearly preservation of identity as Bosnian is so crucial to moving forward. And I think you all spoke to that. And yet, in some ways, there's also that the paradox comes in. This echoes in a way a question that was asked in an earlier panel. The paradox comes in the sort of the diaspora, the pull towards Europe, the pull towards the U.S., and the kind of inevitable dilution of identity that may come out of that. It may be too strong to call it a paradox, but I'm wondering if you can speak to how that. Where there's sort of resilience in the Bosnian identity, not so much from threats from Srpska or within the region, but from just sort of almost cosmopolitanism or metropolitanism of the expansion of Bosnian presence throughout the world. And if I can just add one more thing to that, it's what makes it seem maybe more paradoxical to me is that, the sort of scourge of global contemporary politics is this nationalism, this anti-cosmopolitanism. So maybe it's just a paradox in my head, because I'm thinking it's so important for Bosnians to resist, to maintain that national identity. At the same time, I'm increasingly skeptical of national identities. So, and yet I know that's also the project of some people who wanted to eliminate that national identity. Anyways, that's all. I've said a lot, and maybe not in the most coherent way there, but I'm wondering if you could pick up on this potential tension. Thank you.
I might give it a shot. I think just looking at the Bosnian diaspora community in St. Louis, I think one of the ways that, you talked about what can make it resilient and maintaining the culture and so on. It is very much the ability to be here and there that we have today. We all see the different ways that sort of translocal identities, the way that people sort of not relive, but continue certain practices, certain traditions in their new community that are very much taken from their old community. And so they're able to keep that alive. And I think that's what makes maintaining the identity, as long as that is there and the conditions and that is supported. And I think for local leaders as well, sort of cultivating that ability and the celebration of that, then also cultivates that resilience of maintaining identity. And that's what keeps it alive.
Go, Tomislav.
Thank you. There is basically about this resilience of Bosnian identity. In her book, Renata Salecl, in the book The Spoils of Freedom, she's writing about the phantasmatic structure of the war, this fantasy structure of war, and she said very interesting point, that the hatred of the Serbs toward the Muslims was because they couldn't understand this cosmopolitan structure that they still preserved from former Yugoslavia, like a multinational structure, and they didn't really want to make their own ethnic states. And this kind of different understanding of territory, different understanding of ethnic identity and everything else really provoked a sort of the hatred that was so bloody, because they didn't, and they started to, she said they started basically to invent, trying to invent the Mujahedins and, Muslim threat toward the West and so on, just to provoke possibility of provoking the Bosniak nationalism. Let's be frank and clear, there is a Bosniak nationalism. I saw it with my own eyes, but this is still not the mainstream of the Bosniak identity. Still is not. I think this is partly maybe a answer.
Yes, David.
So yes, thanks. Of course, I don't have an answer to the question, but it's something that was raised by Velma, maybe what David was referring to. In the first session where she was reflecting on the fact that young people are confused about who they are and where they belong, and then Adna was speaking about some sort of identity confusion of young people coming of age in the United States. And, one can have a structural analysis and say that this is what happens when there's a genocidal conflict and 2 million people are forced into the diaspora. But to try to think of, I think it's an important question to raise. What my way of thinking about it is that something that Tomislav was discussing, which had to do something about the fantasy nature of national identity, this phantasmatic nationalism that he was speaking of in certain terms of, but it was the tool that Milosevic used and other Serb nationalists used when they were propagating the idea of a greater Serbia, something that didn't exist, never existed, but which was driving the machine. And I remember when I was in Visegrad with the government exhumation team in 2010, we went downtown and I saw the statue to the Serb defenders of Republika Srpska from the grateful citizens of Visegrad in the middle of the town. But so a little further down, there was a poster of Vojislav Šešelj, and the poster had two different. Well, Šešelj was interesting to be heroized there, but also there was a slogan that said "Sloboda Šešelj," it's the free Šešelj, and behind his head was superimposed on the image of Greater Serbia. So this sort of nationalist imaginary that's been fashioned. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that identity is the creation you know, that it's then fueled by nationalist politicians.
Mhm.
And somehow we need to resist that and create a space for people to develop their own identities. So first we have to create the space.
And if I may mention, it's obviously very complicated because it's the more modern or the most recent identity among Bosnian or Bosniaks, while Serbs had long history of the identity and affiliation with obviously Orthodox Church, and Croats with Catholics. I mean, Muslims kind of struggled. And I think the communist period didn't help, right? Because nationalist and religious identities were suppressed. So I think for all of us growing up in Bosnia, it really depended on your background, on educational level, whether you lived in city versus rural area, who your neighbors were, whether you came from mixed marriage household or not. And then obviously, you know, the war happened, and nationalism and stigma that was attached to the Muslim identity. So I think it's very complicated, and I think all individuals go through different periods in terms of how you identify. When I did my own interviews, I remember people saying, well, I'm proud to be Muslim, Bosnian Muslim, because, you know, I was persecuted because of my identity, and now this is who I am. There are people who, what I found actually from my own research now years ago, was that people who were religious prior to the conflict stayed religious, and people who were not religious stayed non-religious, stay secular mostly. I think people are aware of their identities more, but I think it's complicated because we don't also have one system that is teaching you what this identity is. You know, I think Velma mentioned there is no one education system that says, you know, you're all Bosnians and, you know, you belong to this religion or not, but people are still identifying as Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim, just Bosnian, and so on. And this is a little bit related. I want to ask you a question. One of the audience members said that, you know, asked, what can we do in diaspora to encourage young and second generation Bosnians to become more vested and involved in Bosnian matters in general? Because this is also part of where you're growing up now, whether you're Bosnian in Bosnia or Bosnian in St. Louis or Bosnian in Los Angeles. And, you know, so she said that she found that many young do not feel the connection to Bosnia and are hard to motivate basically to accept this or talk about this. So I don't know if any of you have comments, maybe Adna, because you work with, you know, second and maybe even third generation Bosnians.
No, and I think that's absolutely true. It is difficult to motivate the younger generation, and that is, you know, a factor of the maybe the distance of not having grown up there, but also the silence of not having the stories and not, you know, having the kind of information that could motivate them. But I think also, to generate sort of that engagement, we also have to recognize that it is a younger generation that does think differently. And so appealing to them needs to be different, that it needs to be through, you know, this multi-ethnic approach that is, you know, that resonates more with the younger generation, to sort of introduce them to that history, to expose them to that history more, and try to involve them also in not necessarily overtly political, but sort of more cultural activities that that will, you know, generate that recognition of their family traditions and culture. So I think, but it's definitely a challenge, and we see that in St. Louis as well.
I think we are at 3 o'clock. I just want to remind everyone that the whole symposium has been recorded and will be available through the Genocide Studies Program website at gsp.yale.edu. But I'm going to give the final word to David Simon. And I thank you, obviously, for your insightful and provocative presentations today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I don't know, David, David Pettigrew, we should share the final word in to some extent. So feel free to chime in after my not quite final word. Then I will take Yasmina up on her invitation. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I felt like I had my my final word in my presentation, so Please.
Okay, fair enough.
You and thank you for everything.
Very good. Yeah, a final word. Boy, it's you know, after 4 panels, 2 keynotes, many side conversations, I'm just very grateful. I sort of feel honored and privileged to have been a part of this. I know my name is up at the, you know, billed as one of the organizers, but I've been, I feel like just the beneficiary and not much else. It's been just tremendous for me personally to sit in on this. And I think it's been an important event for so many insightful panelists and keynote speakers to be able to hear them. And I'm glad that there's been in each panel, sometimes after a beat or two, but in each panel, there's been questions and answers from questions from attendees that have been probing and challenging. And I'm grateful for that as well. As Yasmina said, this will all be archived on videotape and available, videotape. It will all be recorded and available online, decidedly not off of tape. I think it's beginning potentially as early as next week. I don't want to overpromise in that regard, but on our website. So it falls one more time falls to me in addition to thanking the panelists and the participants and the guest moderators. I'd like to thank our sponsors one more time. First of all, on behalf of the Genocide Studies program, as one of the hosts at Yale, I'd like to thank the Provost's Office, the Office of Academic Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University, and the Program on Judaic Studies. I'd like to thank the Macmillan Center at Yale. I'd like to thank personally Hira Jaffrey, who has been running the technology for all of these sessions. He's just done an outstanding job. It's been seamless in that respect. Joy Sherman, who pinch hit for a little bit yesterday as well, thanks to her too. Thanks, as I mentioned earlier on, to the Kemp Foundation, which provided some of the funds to make this happen. Yeah, I guess, you know, after all those thanks, I'm not sure I have any further words except essentially go in peace. Like I said, I've been inspired by everyone's dedication, both in a scholarly sense and an activist sense, to Bosnia and its future. And I think there is a lot of energy to take from this event that I hope everyone who is logged on, who is watching, who is watching this on video next week or whenever in the future compared to when I'm saying this, I hope that they are inspired and will remain engaged, involved, and active as well. Enjoy your weekends, everybody, and thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adnan and Tomislav and Yasmina.
Yeah, thank you all. It's wonderful to meet both Adnan and Tomislav.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll
Nice to meet you too.
continue. Yeah.